Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where we do a fair and objective analysis of the church and its truth claims, its history, doctrine, and policy. So we're continuing with our series on Joseph Smith's polygamy. In the last episode, we had a look at William and Jane Law and the Nauvoo Expositor and what led up to Joseph Smith's death. So if you didn't watch that episode, go back and watch it. In this episode, we're going to be looking at polygamy in Utah and the 1890 Manifesto. This is probably one aspect of polygamy that I'm not as knowledgeable on, but I will be referring a lot to the church's Gospel Topics essays. And we're going to start by watching a video from the church's historical department. And they give a good, just sort of like understanding of Utah polygamy and the 1890 Manifesto, but we'll be diving a lot more in depth into some of the controversies surrounding it. So I'll play that video for you first.
So we know over time that there's a lot of pressure put on the Latter-day Saints who are practicing plural marriage. What happens to the Latter-day Saints to get them to a point where they're willing to give up this principle?
When they first announced that they were practicing plural marriage, they were here in Utah, relatively isolated. And so it took a while for the controversy to build. But over the following decades, the national government passed a series of increasingly strident or punitive laws against plural marriage and began enforcing them aggressively. By 1890, when President Woodruff announced the manifesto that led to the end of plural marriage, they were faced with a very simple choice. They could continue to practice plural marriage, but if they did, they would lose the temples because the government was going to confiscate all of the church's property, including the temples, and that would stop the work of salvation for the dead.
How does President Woodruff go about resolving what he should do?
It was something that he prayed and considered and counseled with the other brethren about for quite some time. But finally, in the fall of 1890, he did receive a revelation that resulted in a statement known as the Manifesto. And that began the process of ending plural marriage. Although it took some time for the full implications to be made clear, the Manifesto initially raised a lot of questions. To say we're not going to enter into new plural marriages was one thing, but what did that mean for those who were already in plural families? Did it mean that polygamy would no longer be practiced just in the United States, or did it mean in Mexico and Canada as well, where there were a large number of plural families? Did it mean that plural marriage was ended once and for all, or was it a pause and perhaps it would come back at some time in the future? Those were all questions that had to be worked out through further revelation and through further experience over the course of the next decade or so.
How do they go forward? What sort of counsel is given to church members from church leaders?
Well, the consistent counsel was that you cannot in honor desert your family. And families were counseled to counsel together and to make arrangements as they felt best in order to not abandon their families. And there certainly were some who used the manifesto as an excuse, or perhaps in good conscience thought that it meant that they had to split up. But for the most part, it seems that most Latter-day Saints tried to keep their families together in some form and figure out how to make it work on the ground.
So the general principle then was preservation of the current families, though exactly what that meant could vary.
Yeah, I think that's right. And during that kind of messy closing out period after the manifesto, there were some who still believed that plural marriage was a mandate and should be practiced and wanted to enter into new plural marriages. There were a few leaders who were sympathetic to that view, and so there were a few plural marriages that were authorized after the manifesto. Not very many, and it was a decreasing number. And then by the turn of the 20th century, about 1904, it was Joseph F. Smith who finally issued a statement known as the Second Manifesto, definitively saying we're done with plural marriage, and those who continue to teach and practice it will be disciplined by the church.
So the beginning of plural marriage in Nauvoo, and then the end of plural marriage at the turn of the 20th century, both seem to have been very difficult change is very difficult emotionally for individuals, very difficult as a large societal change, and with a lot of figuring out how to implement it at the beginning and then how to implement it at the end.
I think that's right. And if you think about the fact that this is mortal human beings that are involved, that shouldn't surprise us, that it was a difficult and sometimes messy process.
Yeah, so that video, the church acknowledges that polygamy was practiced in Utah up until 1890. It was illegal in the United States, and the church was getting a lot of pressure, and even certain leaders getting put in prison, and were threatened that they would lose their property, including the temples, if they didn't stop the practice. And you might interpret it as, oh well, the church sort of gave in to societal pressure, and they were overthrown by the government, a true practice and doctrine from God. And Wilford Woodruff brought out either a revelation or a declaration to the church in 1890 that they were going to stop, and advising the saints to stop. But even some secret plural marriages continued until 1904, until the Second Manifesto. So we'll dive more into that as we go on. So this comes from the Church's Gospel Topics essay. So it says, in accordance with the revelation given to Joseph Smith, the practice of plural marriage of one man to two or more women was instituted among the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the early 1840s. Thereafter, for more than half a century, plural marriage was practiced by some Latter-day Saints. Only the church president held the keys authorizing the performance of new plural marriages. In 1890, the Lord inspired church president Wilford Woodruff to issue a statement that led to the end of the practice of plural marriage in the church. In the statement, known as the Manifesto, President Woodruff declared his intention to abide by US law forbidding plural marriage and to use his influence to convince members of the church to do likewise. After the Manifesto, monogamy was advocated in the church both over the pulpit and through the press. But on an exceptional basis, some new plural marriages were performed between 1890 and 1904, especially in Mexico and Canada, outside the jurisdiction of US law. A small number of plural marriages were performed within the United States during those years. In 1904, the church strictly prohibited new plural marriages. Today, any person who practices plural marriage cannot become or remain a member of the church. This essay primarily addresses plural marriage as practiced by Latter-day Saints between 1847 and 1890, following their exodus to the US West and before the Manifesto. And I would check out that essay to find out more. But the church acknowledges that between 1890 to 1904, some plural marriages still happen, not as many. I think it's believed to be under 200. And many of these included and were authorized by the leaders or were the leaders themselves. But yeah, polygamy did not stop at the 1890 Manifesto, and there was a second manifesto. But let's move on. So here's a question. What was the prevalence of polygamy in Utah, and how many wives did most polygamous males have? So Fair Latter-day Saints says that it was around 15 to 20% of families were polygamous, and over a third of all husbands, so nearly 3/4 of all women and over half of all children were spent in polygamy before 1880. So Brigham Young, he was the second prophet of the church. He married 55 women, so he had 55 wives, and many of them were marriages to Joseph's wives, but they were for time as well. John Taylor, he was the third president of the church. He had 8 wives, and Wilford Woodruff, he had 5 wives, and he was the prophet that brought out the Manifesto. So this comes from their Gospel Topics essay. So they say, still some patterns are discernible and they correct some myths. Although some leaders had large polygamous families, 2/3 of polygamous men had only 2 wives at a time. Church leaders recognized that plural marriages could be particularly difficult for women. Divorce was therefore available to women who were unhappy in their marriages. Remarriage was also readily available. Then they go on to say almost all women married, and so did a large percentage of men. In fact, it appears that a large percentage of men in Utah married than elsewhere in the United States at the time. Probably half of those living in Utah Territory in 1857 experienced life in a polygamous family as a husband, wife, or child at some time during their lives. So there was a lot of polygamous relationships happening. Most of the women were engaged in polygamy. But was polygamy, was it illegal in the United States? So the church acknowledges in their essay, the experience of plural marriage towards the end of the 19th century was substantially different from that of earlier decades. Beginning in 1862, the US government passed laws against the practice of plural marriage. Outside opponents mounted a campaign against the practice, stating that they hoped to protect Mormon women and American civilization. For their part, many Latter-day Saint women publicly defended on practice of plural marriage, arguing in statements that they were willing participants. After the US Supreme Court found the anti-polygamy laws to be constitutional in 1879, federal officials began prosecuting polygamous husbands and wives during the 1880s. Believing these laws to be unjust, Latter-day Saints engaged in civil disobedience by continuing to practice plural marriage and by attempting to avoid arrest. When convicted, they paid fines and submitted to jail time. To help their husbands avoid prosecution, plural wives often separated into different households or went into hiding under assumed names, particularly when pregnant or after giving birth. So, in 1862, laws were passed against plural marriage. They began to prosecute those that were practicing polygamy, and many of the members of the church believed those laws to be unconstitutional, that they had the right to practice religion and worship however they saw fit. So really, they were breaking the law, but they probably view polygamy as this is a commandment from God. So they kind of justified it, obeying God as opposed to obeying the law. But many were put in prison over it, and many families were broken up as well. You can see in this picture here many leaders of the church, including George Buchanan, William Gimbert Saunders, William Morley Black. So many of these were put in prison because polygamy was illegal. So this was a revelation given by John Taylor. Now this is quite interesting because in 1886 they were getting a lot of pressure to stop the practice of polygamy. And this is sort of a revelation that John Taylor received from the Lord. So I'm going to read it. It says, "My son, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant, how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord, all commandments that I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. And how can I revoke an everlasting commandment? For I, the Lord, am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants cannot be abrogated nor done away with, but they stand forever." So John Taylor, he's inquiring because they're having a lot of persecution, and he's inquiring about, if they can stop the practice of polygamy. And the Lord is saying that this is an everlasting covenant, that it will stand forever, and that God can't revoke it. He then says, "Have I not given my word in great plainness on this subject? Yet have not great numbers of my people been negligent in the observance of my law and keeping of my commandments? And yet I have borne with them these many years, and this because of their weakness, because of the perilous times, and furthermore, it is more pleasing to me than men should use their free agency in regard to these matters. Nevertheless, I, the Lord, do not change." We read that a lot in the scriptures. The Lord doesn't change. He doesn't change his mind. He doesn't, command and revoke and change his mind. "I, the Lord, do not change, and my word and my covenants and my law do not. And as I have heretofore said by my servant Joseph, all those who would enter into my glory must and shall obey my law. And have I not commanded men that if they were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, they must do the works of Abraham? I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting, and those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof, even so, amen." And then the author of LDS Discussion says that this revelation is important because it is used by polygamous offshoots of the modern day LDS church, as it's quite explicitly stating that God is not going to end polygamy because of the pressure from the government, from society. And the last part is very telling. "And have I not commanded men that if they were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, they must do the works of Abraham? I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting, and those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof." So really, it seems what the Lord is telling President Taylor in 1886, that despite the persecution and the opposition they're getting from the law, that this is a commandment, an everlasting covenant, and that God isn't going to revoke it and that they must do the works of Abraham. But 4 years later, the manifesto does happen, and you might maybe see some connections with the 2015 policy banning the children of gay parents from being baptized in the church, and that was considered a policy and a revelation. And then 4 years later, the policy was overturned, and they were allowed to be baptized, children of gay parents. And a lot of critics would see that as, oh, well, did God just change his mind? Why would God say, bring out this policy 4 years later to change it? And it's very similar to what happens with the manifesto. So this comes from the Gospel Topics essay. This inspiration came when paths for legal redress were still open. The last of the paths closed in May 1890 when the US Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Edmunds-Tucker Act, allowing the confiscation of church property to proceed. President Woodruff saw that the church's temples and its ordinances were now at risk. Burdened by this threat, he prayed intensely over the matter. The Lord showed me by vision and revelation. He later said exactly what would take place if we did not stop this practice, referring to plural marriage. All the temples would go out of our hands. God has told me exactly what to do and what the result would be if we did not do it. So really, if the church didn't stop, they would lose the temples, which would stop all the ordinances and, doing the ordinances for the salvation of the dead, and they would lose their property, and that the church would pretty much crumble if they didn't stop this. And you could say Wilford Woodruff was foreseeing this. I know a critic would push back and say, well, why didn't the Lord say this to John Taylor in 1886? And is this the Lord sort of revoking the command of plural marriage and changing his mind? On September 25th, 1890, President Woodruff wrote in his journal that he was under the necessity of acting for the temporal salvation of the church. He stated, after praying to the Lord and feeling inspired by his spirit, I have issued a proclamation. This proclamation, now published in the Doctrine and Covenants as Official Declaration 1, was released to the public on September 25th and became known as the Manifesto. This manifesto was carefully worded to address the immediate conflict with the US government. We are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice. President Woodruff said, inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages, which laws have been pronounced constitutional by the court of last resort, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise. So Fair Latter-day Saints has to say that President Woodruff did not frame the matter as a declaration from the First Presidency and the 12, which would be required for any official change in doctrine or practice. Rather, he spoke of the manifesto as a duty on his part, which the Lord required. I think, though, I would push back that he did make it seem like it was a revelation he received by the Spirit and him acting in the role as prophet. But they say even the wording of the manifesto reflects this. It does not speak of we, the First Presidency and Council of the 12, but simply of Wilford Woodruff in the first person singular. The wording is careful and precise. I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise. And I now publicly declare that my advice to the Latter-day Saints is to refrain from contracting any marriage forbidden by the law of the land. And they say, thus, President Woodruff announces a personal course of action, but does not commit other general authorities of the church. He even issues advice rather than a command or instruction. No other signatures or authorities are given other than his own. And perhaps this is maybe why some of the members and church leaders continued to practice polygamy after the 1890 manifesto, because they didn't see it maybe as a strict commandment that we're definitely stopping. And perhaps this is a way to publicly make it seem like we're stopping the practice and he's discouraging it. Although I think a critic would say it's quite clear that he's telling them to stop this practice because it's illegal, it's against the law, and they're going to get prosecuted for it. So I'm going to skip this part. Let's just see what Anne Wilde has to say. So after the 1890 manifesto, polygamy was still practiced, and even certain church leaders. So Anne Wilde, an expert on polygamy, said this on Gospel Tangents. As far as we know, there's pretty good evidence that he took a plural wife. This is Wilford Woodruff, after the Manifesto himself. We also have very good evidence that many of the apostles, the Quorum of the 12, took additional wives after 1890. That's one reason why that 1904 Manifesto had to come out, is to put teeth in it, because so many people were very quietly taking additional wives, especially in Canada and Mexico. Now, this is kind of disconcerting. I didn't learn about this until a couple of years ago, that even though 1890, the Manifesto makes it saying that's when the church completely stopped polygamy, no, even some of the church members, and particularly the leaders, even Wilford Woodruff, publicly stating that the church has stopped the practice, in secret, we're still performing plural marriages, which is, I won't defend it. I think that's really bad. So here's the question. So why were there some marriages performed after the Manifesto? So this is what Fair Latter-day Saints have to say. So they acknowledge that there was a number that were performed after the Manifesto, and that some of these marriages were apparently sanctioned by some positions of church leadership. I think they definitely were, and definitely some leaders also performed plural marriages and had additional wives during that period. So does this demonstrate that the Manifesto was merely a political tactic, and that the revelation of the Manifesto was merely a cynical ploy? Do post-Manifesto marriages demonstrate the LDS Church's contempt for the civil law of the land? So this is what they have to say. Some church members unfamiliar with the history behind the aggressive federal anti-polygamy movement have been troubled by critics who try to portray church members and leaders' choices as dishonest and improper. It is important to realize that this is a point on which modern enemies of the church would be impossible to satisfy if the church had acquiesced to government pressure and stopped polygamy completely in 1890. The church would then be charged with having revelations on demand, or with abandoning something they claimed was divine under government pressure. In fact, prior to the Manifesto, the attorney prosecuting Elder Lorenzo Snow for polygamy predicted that if Snow and others were found guilty and sent to prison, church leaders would find it convenient to have a revelation setting aside the commandment on polygamy. So I think the point they're trying to make is, well, they continued to practice polygamy after the Manifesto because it just would have seemed convenient that they stopped as soon as church leaders were being imprisoned. That's a convenient revelation. But I think it is very bad in my view that they continue to practice plural marriage in secret, because the 1890 Manifesto from the prophet, like imagine if that came from President Nelson today, saying, you know, advising and admonishing us to stop, you know, he'd received this revelation that polygamy is to stop, you know, we'll lose our temples if we continue it, but then secretly they still did it. I think it's very hard to defend that in my view. So the second Manifesto, his testimony conveyed a distinction church leaders had long understood. So this is Joseph F. Smith. The Manifesto removed the divine command for the church collectively to sustain and defend plural marriage. It had not, up to this time, prohibited individuals from continuing the practice or perform plural marriage as a matter of religious conscience. During his Senate testimony, President Smith promised publicly to clarify the church's position about plural marriage. At the April 1904 General Conference, President Smith issued a forceful statement known as the Second Manifesto, attaching penalties to entering into plural marriage. So this time, if they were going to continue to practice plural marriage after the Second Manifesto, church action and church discipline would follow. They're really cracking down on it now. If any officer or member of the church shall assume to solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he will be deemed in transgression against the church and will be liable to be dealt with according to the rules and regulations thereof. The Second Manifesto was a watershed event. For the first time, church members were put on notice that new plural marriage stood unapproved by God and the church. This was a very big deal. 2 of the 12 were actually dropped for performing plural marriages. One of them was actually excommunicated. The others disfellowshipped for performing plural marriages after the Second Manifesto. So a lot of people really struggled with the Manifesto, and people were still practicing it after the first one, and even after the second. The church acknowledges in their essay that a couple of the apostles were pretty much kicked out, and one was excommunicated because they didn't stop the practice because of all those previous teachings of, you know, polygamy being a commandment, being an everlasting covenant, a doctrine. And that's why we have all these FLDS shoots and break-off groups of people who believe that no, polygamy is an eternal principle that shouldn't have been stopped. So here's a timeline basically of polygamy. Just pause the screen and have a look through it yourself. I'm not going to read through it all. But this is what the church has to say on polygamy in their Gospel Topics essay. So they say, for many who practiced it, plural marriage was a significant sacrifice. Despite the hardship some experienced, the faithfulness of those who practice plural marriage continues to benefit the church in innumerable ways. Through the lineage of these 19th century saints have come many Latter-day Saints who have been faithful to their gospel covenants as righteous members, mothers and fathers, loyal disciples of Jesus Christ, and devoted church members, leaders, and missionaries. And remember, in Jacob 2, one of the purposes of polygamy is to raise a righteous seed. And there's been many, righteous members of the church that have come from polygamy. So polygamy is part of our heritage. Although members of the contemporary church are forbidden to practice polygamy, modern Latter-day Saints honor and respect those pioneers who gave so much for their faith, families, and community. So here's just a brief summary of what we've gone through in this episode. In 1852, the church publicly announced and taught polygamy to the general church membership. It was kept hidden or secret in Nauvoo, and it was only told to a small number of members. Early church leaders practiced plural marriage, and a large percentage of church membership also practiced polygamy also. The US brought out laws against polygamy, and it was also approved by the US Supreme Court. Latter-day Saints believed these laws to be unjust and unconstitutional and continued to practice polygamy despite it being against the law, and some church leaders were imprisoned. John Taylor in 1886 taught that polygamy wasn't, or received a revelation that polygamy was an everlasting covenant and principle and that it shouldn't be overthrown or revoked by God. However, in 1890, President Wilford Woodruff announced the Manifesto, which he claims that he received through, praying about it and receiving sort of like a vision of what would happen to the church and being told by the Lord to stop polygamy or else they would lose the temples and the work of salvation for the dead. So that's why the manifesto happened. Some plural marriages were secretly practiced until the second manifesto, until 1904, even by some of the leaders of the church. But then in 1904, Joseph F. Smith made it a crime before the church, and excommunication would result if any new marriages were entered into. Definitely very messy Utah polygamy, and especially what happened around the manifesto. Very sort of troubling and messy that polygamy was sort of secretly being practiced even when it was against the law and even after the manifesto. But if you want to find out more, I would definitely read through the Gospel Topics essay. Also, I talk about this in my interview with Brian Hale, so I'll link that at the end of the video and just have a look at what they have to say. In the next episode, we'll be looking at, is polygamy doctrinal? So we'll be having a look at maybe statements from past leaders such as Gordon B. Hinckley. What did Brigham Young teach about polygamy? And is polygamy required in the next life? Is it essential for exaltation? So we'll be discussing that in the next episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up. Please like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to comment underneath. And subscribe to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph. I try to be fair and objective. I try to look at, what faithful sources say and also the arguments of critics. I don't have all the answers. I'm not an expert, but I'm trying to do as well as I can with the research and with the sources. But definitely this is not a finished overview of polygamy. There's so much more to it, but I'm trying to be thorough and discuss a lot of the controversial topics and for people to have just more awareness with regards to the messiness and the troubling issues and what are some of the faithful responses to it and some of the critical arguments. So please subscribe to my channel. If you care to support me, you can to my PayPal, stephen.murphy1996@outlook.com. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.